Well, today we're going to talk about ethics in criminal justice research. Whoa, look how trippy the frickin' first slide is, man. Sorry. So the reason why we're going to talk about this is, if you think about it, if we did not care about any single person in the world, just think how advanced we would be scientifically. And this is especially the case in human research. Like, if we could just force a bunch of people to do something so that we can study them, how much would we learn? Right? The problem is, it's not really a problem, but like, most of the time when people participate in studies, right, they've volunteered to do so. And so there's some third or spurious variables that can come with that. But if we forced certain people to participate in studies, it would be pretty nice. You'd learn a lot of things from a scientific perspective, but you would cause a lot of trauma. What if you could take children right at the moment that they're born and isolate them from society and determine which things are learned socially and which things are carried over genetically? We can then essentially solve the conundrum of what's more important, nature or nurture. But just think how unethical that would be to take someone's child away from them. That child had absolutely no say as to whether they wanted to be in this experiment or not. And you're essentially ruining a whole human life. So especially since criminal justice research involves human beings, I'd say most of the time, most criminal justice research involves humans. And that's why we need to talk about ethics. And let's see if I'll burn my mouth drinking tea again. Yeah, a little bit. This time I waited a little longer. So Hitler. We all know Hitler, right? If you're one of those people that denies the Holocaust, I kindly ask you to never share that opinion with me, okay? Because you're wrong. But I'm assuming most of you who are in this class are relatively sensible and understand that the Holocaust actually happened, and it was a horrible period of time for people in the Jewish community in Europe and other communities as well. But a lot of Jewish people were killed by the Nazis. So with that, Hitler saw an opportunity to conduct myriad very cruel experiments on some of the people who were in the concentration camps, of whom many were from the Jewish community. And the unfortunate thing is, right, a lot of what we know today about cancer research and genetic research are from these studies. For instance, we didn't really know much scientifically about what long-term exposure to the elements would how that would impact the body. And so through Hitler's experiments, they were able to control for other factors and just see what the impact of prolonged exposure to the elements would have on the body. Now, that's good from a scientific perspective, in that we're learning about the human body, how we can protect it, how far you can sort of push the limits on the body. But you're absolutely putting a person, a human being with feelings, with family, who was a tiny baby once, who was an innocent little child once, you're taking someone like that and you're putting them through one of probably the most traumatic experience ever. And then they also die at the end. Is what we learned from those experiments really worth that amount of intense trauma? Is there maybe another way that might not be as direct, but that would also allow us to gain those insights, maybe not as clearly, but to a point where you're not putting someone through such horrible agony and trauma. That's where ethics in research comes in. Now, Hitler didn't care about the Jewish community because he spewed a bunch of BS that said that the Aryan race was better than them. And so he saw it more like how we conduct experiments on animals today. And in criminal justice, right, we're talking also about people's lives here. It might not be quite as overt as thinking about medical research, but if you think about justice and the law and the control that the law has on people, just like a pill may ruin your life or kill you, so can the law or agents of it. So can experimenting with that can seriously injure or hurt you. And so that's what we'll be talking about. So what is ethics, right? What is right and what is wrong? Well, it's really subjective, right? It differs across time and space, and it differs also by who decides. But ethics is a little more fluid than the law, right? Oftentimes the law is born out of ethics, but ethics, right, there are certain things like, for instance, you might be breaking the law. For instance, who here has ever smoked pot, right? Smoke pot, and then in a group, right? And we all know there's that rule that says puff, puff, pass, meaning that, let's say you have a joint, right? And you sit and you have a group of 5 people, and you're all smoking a joint together. And now the joint comes to you in the rotation, right? And you sit there and you're just smoking this thing until it's almost done, right? People there will be like, yo, come on, man, puff, puff, pass, right? You take a hit, you blow it out, you take a hit, and then you pass. Or sometimes you might have a person who is in the rotation, right? And the marijuana has already started taking effect on them. And so they get the joint, and then they're in the middle of talking, right? And they're just talking and talking and talking and talking and talking, and then the joint goes out. They didn't puff, puff. They didn't even puff, puff before they puff, puff, passed. All right? There's no law about that, right? But everyone in that group's like, that's wrong. Because that is part of the ethics within that social context, which depends on time and space, meaning where they are, what country or town or where you are, and that you're in this time, right? Maybe in the old days, I don't know, medieval times, and marijuana wasn't such a part of culture. Maybe there was no puff puff pass rule. I don't know. I don't know anything about marijuana smoking, nor do I know anything about marijuana smoking in the Middle Ages. Okay. But nonetheless, ethical behavior is behavior that conforms to any group's pretty much arbitrary standards. Now, yes, there are some standards that different groups share, like murder. I'd say the majority of groups across the world of human beings would say murder, not cool. But then when it comes to qualifying, well, what exactly is murder, right? One group might be like, well, if they spew this type of, agenda, well, then we can murder them. Well, if they killed this type of person, then we can kill them. If they killed anyone at all, well, then we can kill them, right? Think about how the debate about what should we do with people who have molested children, right? When you go on the internet, which is a dangerous place, but when you go on the internet and you read a story about a child that's been molested, right, you always have some people who say, you should have killed him, kill him. Certain things are pretty easy to agree on, but the more complicated it gets, the more difficult it is to find agreement. And so that's why different groups at different ethical standards. And so you might have people saying, well, this type of research is totally not ethical right now, while other people maybe 70 years ago would be like, oh, it's totally fine, right? And the unfortunate thing about ethical standards are that just how arbitrary ethical standards are, they're also very difficult to decide which is best when. There's no black and white, right? The world is a gray mess. So there is no, this is always wrong, this is always right. Yeah, there's some things like murdering people, pretty much always wrong. But, doing a study to learn about how people respond to a rape in progress, somebody accidentally gets punched in the face during that, I don't know, that's kind of worth it, right? Oh, I burnt myself again. Ugh. No matter what the study, it involves some sort of risk to your participants, right? Sometimes it might be psychological, right? I remember one time I was doing interviews with police officers, and I happened to ask the officer something about a body-worn camera. But that officer had a week and a half ago been involved in an officer-involved shooting where he killed someone for the first time in his life. Now, I didn't know that at the time. And so me asking something about how has body camera footage saved your, what was the question exactly? It was, to what extent has body-worn cameras been used to review your behavior? Or something like that. Well, all of a sudden, this cop starts, acting strange and just spills the whole story about killing someone for the first time and the emotions that came with that. Talking about how he sees, people tagging him on Facebook with the video of him shooting the person, right? Because he had a body camera on. So he shot and killed this person. That footage was released by the police chief to the media. The media put it, on social media, and then it starts getting shared. And so people would be would tag him in that video. And be like, good on you, brother, or whatever. But still. So, an instance that is already traumatic, that because of body camera footage has now to be reviewed and reviewed and reviewed and reviewed, and you watch it over and over and over again. You watch one of the most stressful times in your life over and over and over again, and then everybody wants to talk to you about it, and then it's shared all over the media, and then some researcher comes in not knowing a damn thing about what happened, or that it was that particular officer who was involved. And all of a sudden, this person is having a panic attack during the interview. I was a researcher, and I caused emotional harm to that person by asking a question that I thought was largely innocuous. So in that case, I wouldn't say it was necessarily my fault. Maybe I could have poked around a bit, but this officer was selected at random. So I didn't really know. And here I harmed this person. But at the same time, I learned a lot out of that. I learned a lot about the role of body-worn camera footage in police shootings from that very interview. One of the things that I pointed out in a paper I wrote subsequently was how the administrative process of reviewing body-worn cameras re-traumatizes or can re-traumatize some officers. So, can harm happen? Yes. If you can reduce it, try to reduce it as much as possible, but you will never be able to completely reduce it. And my experience is a clear one. I thought I had followed all the precautions. I had IRB approval, which we'll talk about what that means, right? I was good to go. And I asked a question I thought would be, not a big deal. And there you go. I just re-traumatized this person. Now, they were very kind and finished the interview with me, and they calmed down, and then they were embarrassed. And I was like, nah. I even offered to completely get rid of the interview. I was like, I can delete this interview right now. We can call it quits. Don't worry about it. And he insisted that I use it. So I used it, and it was great data. So the way that hotspots policing research usually works is you'll have, each jurisdiction will have a multitude of hotspots, right? They don't just have one hotspot. So you randomly select hotspots that will get directed patrols and randomly select hotspots that won't get directed patrols. And then after several weeks, it'll usually be like 6 to 8 to 10, maybe a couple months, you compare the crime rates for a particular crime you were focusing on in those two, across the control beats and the treatment beats. And so essentially what that means is that the type of policing that's happening in that jurisdiction is not the same across the jurisdiction. So certain people might have randomly lived in a neighborhood that all of a sudden is getting all of this police presence. Now, some people might be getting arrested who normally would not have been getting arrested. And during that process, they physically get into harm's way. Or by sending police officers into a hotspot where a lot of things go down. Some of these officers might be getting hurt or shot or something happening to them because they are essentially focusing a lot of their time and energy in these beats that are extremely, or in these spots that are extremely concentrated in terms of crime, putting themselves in harm's way. And it's not because of their normal behavior, it's because they happen to fall into your treatment group of your experiment. It's a result of me. And at the same time, right, psychological harm can happen to the people getting arrested and the police officers putting themselves in harm's way. And then there's always this aspect of embarrassment, right? One of the reasons when I had that interview with that police officer who started having like this panic episode or whatever you want to call it, it was intense, and I felt awful. Right? During the interview process, you can say things or you can ask things that might be embarrassing to some people. And you have to be cognizant of that because that is a type of harm. So that's why I told the person, look, we can stop this right now. I can delete this interview in front of you, get rid of it. It's like it never happened. Because I knew I was opening them up, not just to psychological harm, which I couldn't undo at that point, right? But I wanted to make sure that there's not this embarrassment added on to it, right? And so the officer then, on the recording essentially gave me the permission to continue the interview and said that he wanted me to keep it in the, he wanted me to use the data and whatnot if it was relevant or whatever. But yeah, embarrassment. Another thing that's important is that it's not just the research subjects, right? And I've used a multitude of examples of that are at risk, but also the researcher themselves or someone that's just a bystander. Or let's say because of the hotspots policing thing, a shootout breaks out and some random kid gets shot during that. It's a third party, nothing to do with it. Or to give you a better example, there was a social experiment a very long time ago about how would people react to to thinking someone is being raped, right? And so there's an experiment where this person, this scientist was hired a bunch of student actors to pretend someone was being raped, and then would see how many bystanders would hear that and then try to intervene. Well, let me tell you this. If I was walking and I saw someone that I thought was getting raped, I would most definitely intervene, right? But in that process, right, not only I could get injured because now I'm trying to attack someone I might not be physically able to do, or I might hurt myself running up on it or trying to tackle this person and hurt myself, but maybe I would beat up this actor who is raping someone and not stopping when I should be stopping, right? How many of us have seen those social experiment YouTube videos, right, where these dudes do all kinds, you get many different types of YouTube experiments, YouTube social experiments, right? But you see these people and they really piss someone off and then they end up getting punched. I remember there was this one dude that would go up to people, and he was a guy, and he would go up to other men, and how men usually give each other the high five thing. They bring it in for a quick little bro hug, right? And so what he would do is he would do the bro hug. He'd do the high five, bring it in for the bro hug, and then boom, give him a kiss on the cheek. Well, he would go and do that to particularly sort of very masculine looking men, so dudes that were buff, jacked up. And he did it to one dude, and this one dude just popped them right in the face and knocked them out cold, right? So now this is just a YouTube experiment, but if this were an actual scholarly study, right, that researcher definitely got injured during that. There's harm, exposed himself to harm, right? Now an IRB, I don't know if an IRB would actually okay a study like that where you would give someone a kiss on the cheek, because you're inching into this sexually inappropriate territory, right? If I were an IRB member, I'd be very hesitant to okay that, right? And that's why it's a YouTube experiment and not a real one. So while as a rule we want to always make things as voluntary as possible, we can't 100% ensure it. So pay attention to that when you're taking a quiz. I'll give you an example again from my own research. I did a big body-worn camera study a couple of years back, and I received permission from the police chief, and then I asked individual police officers, right, 100 and something. I emailed 100 and, or no, I think, yeah, it was I emailed 220 something people. I ended up getting 106 of them to participate. Nonetheless, I got permission. I needed voluntary permission from the police chief, the person who ran the whole show, and then also from individual police officers who I wanted to interview and do ride-alongs with. Then I also had to email every single one again, and so I had to get permission just from the department to do the study, voluntary permission from individual officers to do an interview, voluntary permission from individual officers to do observations, and voluntary permission from individual officers to take my survey, right? So things were so voluntary, it's not even funny, okay? It was exhausting how voluntary it was. And before you start the interview, you have to be look, you can stop this at any point in time, you can tell me to bugger off, whatever, right? However, there was still some elements there where voluntary participation was not ensured. For instance, so I remember there was one officer who I emailed, and I said, can we do this interview? And he said, yes. I did the interview. And I said, can we do an observation? And he said, yes. But anyway, so we go on this call. We get a call. It was in a rich neighborhood. And, we were all kind of shocked. We're like, wow, we're getting a call in this neighborhood. So we go there. And it turns out it was a couple who had just recently been divorced. And they had two daughters. And they were supposed to be at mom's house that night. which is in a very beautiful neighborhood, beautiful house. But the girls called Dad and said, Dad, Mom's been drinking. Mom's been very mean to us. Mom hit us. We want to come home with you. So Dad, being angry about what he heard, whether it's true or not what the girls said, drives over to the mom's house, demands the girls come with him. The girls run out of the house into Dad's car. Mom gets angry, calls the police because it's my night to have these kids. Why are you coming in here taking the kids when it's my turn to have them? This is BS. They're not telling the truth. I yelled at them because they wouldn't listen, blah, 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 blah. Right? So it was a domestic dispute. So we show up. And, the two officers go in. They separate the girls from the mom and dad, and they interview them separately. And I'm wearing like a bulletproof vest. And I'm just following the two officers with whatever they're doing. And so at some point they're talking to Mom. And Mom looks at me and she goes, "Excuse me, who are you?" And so I just remain silent. And the police officer's like, "He's a researcher. He's allowed to be here, blah, 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 blah." Same thing with Dad. And so the thing is that they are included in my data. Now they're de-identified. Right? Meaning like, I don't know their names. I didn't even when they said their names, I didn't even listen. I didn't record that. I recorded white female, dark hair, in her mid 40s to 50. Right? I sort of created like a very basic profile of them so I can remember some demographic information. Same thing with Dad. Right, and that was that. But they are in my study, but they never voluntarily participated. Right, they were just sort of a piece of that study. Now, so when I had to explain that to my IRB, so the IRB are people who approve your study before you're allowed to go do it. Right, and they're usually within your university, and we'll talk about that a little later. One of the things they said is this might happen. And so my rebuttal to that was, but I'm de-identifying everything. So even though these people will be involuntarily participating in my study, I am not giving any information away that would identify them. Right? That I'm not even saying, I even told the police agency I wouldn't even use their real name. So when you read my articles on this research, it doesn't even have the real police agency's name. I don't even say where. All I say is it's in the eastern United States. So it's very difficult to figure out what police agency, let alone which officers I was with, let alone what time and what date and time, or who the actual citizens were then that we're interacting with. So all of that gave the IRB enough to say, okay, well, even though there will be cases where people will involuntarily be participating in my study, that I will not be making that information public, so it will cause zero harm to them. The only area where there was harm possible was for me, right? Mom or dad might have gotten really mad that I was there and thrown a brick at me. I don't know, right? I remember one time I was at a different police agency doing a study, a similar study, also following police officers, and we found a guy that was extremely drunk, and so we had like a group of officers standing around him in like a circle, and he was literally just blowing off steam, like yelling at everyone, and he was essentially going in a circle roasting everyone, just saying, "You stupid ass, blah 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 blah, cop, blah 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 blah." And he eventually sees me, and he starts, and he realizes I'm not dressed like the rest of them, and he's spouting off at me, and I'm just remaining silent. And then he did one of those he lunged towards me, right, as if he was gonna headbutt me, and it just threw me completely off, and I jerked back, and I was like, holy crap. And then he laughed at me, and all the cops laughed at me, right? and I looked like a total, like I looked like the nerd I am. Okay, sorry. Nonetheless, let's say he actually went through with that and actually headbutted me, right? I could have gotten harmed there, and so I had to, when I try to get my study approved by the IRB, I had to emphasize, like, look, I'm the only one here that can get into harm's way, but I am not going to say anything to the citizens unless they ask me a question that's pertinent, right? That would cause me to inflame any situations, right? And it's also from a methodological standpoint, you don't want to say anything. You don't want to add any more ingredients to the situation. You want the situation to be as natural as possible when you observe it. And then I also said that if these citizens at any point in time asked me to not be included in the study, I would then say to them, okay, fine, I won't. But that in itself is not necessary. You do not have to exclude them. It's just something that I said I would do, right? But it never came to that. The problem with, again, right, so voluntary participation from an ethical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, but from a scientific inquiry standpoint, it's difficult, right? Because essentially, all of our data about human beings are based on people who are willing to participate in a study. And this is all fine and dandy and all, but like, especially when it comes to the police, you get some super cantankerous police officers who have very strong opinions about things, especially when it comes to reforms and innovations, who do not ever want to participate in any study. And those are really the people whose insights I'd like to know. Right? What are they thinking? How can I convince someone as cantankerous as this person? At the same time, right, when you're studying the impacts of drug use or the impacts of criminal histories or even criminal contacts, right? If you have if your findings are based on the few prostitutes who would participate in your study or the few drug users or drug dealers who would participate in your study, what are you missing? What's different about them from those who do not want to participate? So when it comes to generalizing your findings, it's hard, right? It's not 100%. But it is still good enough because you're not traumatizing people, you're not harming people, you're not embarrassing them, and you're not putting yourself in harm's way. So again, it's like this, you're weighing your options here. Another thing you want to ensure is that people can't be identified. So I've used the term de-identified before. You don't want people to read your study and be like, aha, it's this particular person who you're talking about. Right? Because that, again, opens people up to psychological harm and embarrassment. So we usually try to combat that through either acknowledging that you're going to do whatever you can to keep things confidential or to keep things anonymous. So my studies that I've conducted, I had to say everything is going to be confidential because when I am doing an interview with someone, I see their face, I see their name tag. I had to email them to get permission, so I know who they are. So I essentially swore confidentiality to them. Right? I gave them a whole thing that they signed and that I signed that says I'm not going to frickin' tell people what you're telling me here. And when I do tell people what you're telling me here, they're not going to know what police agency you're from and they're not going to know what your name is. Right? They're going to know that you were a male or a female. But there are some studies where you can even go a step better and ensure anonymity. And with anonymity, the researcher themselves doesn't even know who said what, right? So if I had if I was interviewing officers in one of those like Catholic confession booths and I couldn't actually look through the thing to see who they were, that would be considered anonymity. But usually anonymity can be mostly insured when it comes to surveys, right? Especially when you send like an email survey out, that's anonymous. It doesn't need to be confidential. So when you can't ensure anonymity, you have to ensure confidentiality, right? So here's a question. Can we deceive our subjects? Are we allowed to lie to them? Yes and no. You generally don't want to do that. But if you do, you need to have a damn good explanation for it, right? Sometimes when people know what the purpose of the study is, it will influence their behavior, right? So if you tell them, the actual purpose of the study, and it would change the way they would respond to a survey, or they would respond to an interview, or behave out in the field, well, then it's worth maybe deceiving them. For instance, I'll give you an example. Like when I first started my job as a criminal justice professor at a different university, I wanted to do interviews with online call girls, right? So these are prostitutes who use websites like Craigslist, Backpage, and there's a bunch of them. But anyways, they use some of these websites to advertise sex for money. Now, what makes these prostitutes different from your average street prostitute is that they're usually belonging to the middle to upper class, and they tend to charge a lot more money. They tend to be in more control of their situation. They seldom have like a quote unquote pimp, right? But at the same time, when I wanted to do that, we didn't know much about online call girls. And so I decided I was going to reach out to some of these call girls using all the websites they advertise on. The problem is that I was too honest with them. I told them I was a criminal justice researcher, and the second they heard the word criminal justice, they thought I was a cop. And I had 2 prostitutes who were willing to talk to me. And then one prostitute got arrested, and the second that she got arrested, word went out to, it's like they had this underground prostitute network. And the second I emailed them, they were like, I know who you are, I'm not talking to you. They thought it was all because of me. All right, now, luckily, I had nothing to do with anyone getting arrested. It was just by chance. I was literally just reaching out to people still to see if it's even something that was possible. But it made me think, would I have done better if I had lied to them, if I had deceived them? Maybe if I said that I was a social scientist, or maybe if I said that I was a gender studies professor. But maybe lying to them and telling them I was not a criminal justice professor would have been okayed by my IRB, right? It would have been enough deception to allow them to participate in my study without feeling weird. Because let's say even they did participate in my study, and I told them that I was a criminal justice professor, right? They might have decided that they would not say anything that would incriminate themselves out of fear that I would get them arrested for something, despite the fact that there's laws protecting them. So maybe in that case, it would have been better to just tell a little white lie. And when we study the criminal underground, we often have to use some deception in order to get in. But it's not always good, because you can open people up to being arrested, you can open people up to being victimized, being robbed, being murdered, being whatever. You can open yourself up to that. So what I'm trying to say is that in general, you do not want to deceive your subjects, but there are very few cases where you may ask your IRB whether it's okay, because you telling them the truth would impact the way they respond to your research. Another ethical issue is telling the truth with your results. One of the problems is that sometimes you want to be right. Sometimes you're so damn sure that you are right. But then you conduct a study and you realize, nope, that's not the case. Well, a survey is a survey. You can change those results to fit whatever your narrative was. And that might make you seem like you discovered something brand new and something great. But you're lying to people. You're creating false truth. And especially in the world we live in today, where for some reason the Republican Party tends to not believe science, which in of itself is absurd to me, that you can just believe whatever you want now, and that comes from the Republican Party. But in a world like that, when a legitimate researcher is caught falsifying data or making up data or falsely reporting data, it doesn't help our cause. It doesn't help elevate the legitimacy of scientific discovery. So even when you discover something that doesn't fit your hypothesis, you just report it. When your study has limitations, say what the limitations were. When you find something that's kind of boring and it doesn't really add much, then you report it that way, because that is much better for getting to know what the truth is. Because that's the whole point of science, right? The whole point of science is for us to figure out what the hell is going on. Where do we come from? What are we doing? What's the best way to deal with people who won't listen to the rules? How do we make people's lives better in the long term? But some people get so stuck in the mud about being prestigious scholars, people looking up to them, being popular in the scholarly world, that they forget what it's all about. What about legal liability? Well, like I said earlier, pretty much the way that it works is that if I'm a researcher and I discover criminal activity, I cannot be subpoenaed. There are also other issues that are important when you're a researcher, right? Like when I was collecting data at the police agency, one thing I had to be very careful of was not disrupting everything, right? Like there were certain very high intensity situations when I was doing my ride-alongs, my observations, where the police officers like, just stay in the car, right? Like, I don't want you to get shot, right? I don't want you to be in the way when we're trying to do like a tactical maneuver, right? So I'd like roll the window down. And there's another time where the officer was like, just take cover behind this vehicle for me, please. Another issue we talked about earlier is like, you can have all these unintended consequences, like doing hotspots police, you can all of a sudden destroy community relations and you didn't mean for that, right? You might have adverse effects. You might all of a sudden have a bunch of officers get attacked, right? Your experiment might cause a George Floyd type of situation where, let's say, I'm trying a new technique. It's a new psychological technique that shows a lot of promise. And so I go to a prison and I find people who are about a year away from being released. And I randomly select 200 people. And 100 of them come into my treatment group. And so this is where I try this new psychological technique on them. They go through this whole program that's based on this new technique. And everyone is released. Now the 100 people who went through my treatment, only 2 of them get rearrested and come back to prison. But those who were randomly selected into the control group who don't get anything, 90 of them come back to prison. Right? The only difference is that was randomness. One person was randomly placed in another group than the other. And essentially I've withheld treatment from the other group. You sort of like, you only help one group, right? It's this unintended consequence. And so usually what we try to do is if we are realizing a treatment is really working, we try to give it to the other group. So it's like, let's say we come up with a coronavirus vaccine that actually works. It's not just, Russian propaganda. and we give it to our one group, and all of a sudden these people are cured. You want to give it to the people who only got the placebo, so that they can also get the benefit from that. So we have all these ethical things that were talked about: voluntary participation, informed consent, and all this stuff, confidentiality, etc., etc., etc. But like, where does that come from? Or how is it enforced? So in the United States, we had this experiment called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I put up a couple of documentaries about it. I'm not going to explain it in this video for the sake of time, because we're already like hitting an hour over here. But the Tuskegee experiment caused a lot of trauma for the participants. We'll say it like that. You can watch the video. And as a result, the United States government created the Belmont Report. And so this report was created with the purpose of coming up with ethical guidelines that United States researchers will use to conduct research involving human beings. All right? And the Belmont Report essentially says that when you're conducting a study, you must ask yourself, am I being respectful to persons? Am I allowing them autonomy? Which essentially means, are they voluntarily participating? Am I humiliating them? Am I putting them through unnecessary trauma and strain and anxiety? Is this study producing beneficence? Meaning that, am I doing the best I can to reduce harm to people? I'm aware, yes, I can't 100% reduce harm, even though that would be great if there would be no harm to anyone in research. But am I doing everything I can, right? And this is where I had that police officer, right, who was having the panic attack in front of me. I said, hey, we can stop this right now. Hey, I will delete this video right in front of you. You can watch me do it. You don't have to be here. So beneficence is do as little harm as possible and maximize the benefits you get from it. And then justice. Making sure that people are treated fairly. Making sure that when you are selecting a treatment group, that you're not just selecting people you want in your group. Like, so let's say I'm a racist, right? And I select only one race of people to be in my coronavirus vaccine group, and the vaccine cures them all. And then the other group that gets no vaccine, I don't give them anything. Which is kind of like, essentially the Tuskegee experiment was, we're not going to give any of these black men treatment for syphilis. And we're going to see what it does to them. That's not justice, right? So based on these three ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, came all of these things like, well, ensure anonymity, and if you can't do that, then confidentiality. Make sure that people know what they're getting into. Make sure you have informed consent. Make sure that participation is voluntary, that people know they can stop participating at any point in time. Do whatever you can to reduce the amount of harm that you might cause. Try to anticipate as much harm as possible that you may cause and try to prevent that. And if you cause unintended harm, do what you can to fix it. And so IRBs, or institutional review boards, these are committees that exist within any institution that conducts research. So at SUNY Oswego, they have an IRB. At the University of Southern Indiana, I served on the IRB. And so essentially, any person who wants to do research at that university needs to write a little proposal and send that to the IRB, and then the IRB will decide whether it's ethical or not. And they'll say, well, we're not going to approve this, so you got to change this. And then you got to change your study until it meets the criteria. So the IRB, they enforce rules that are based on the concepts highlighted in the Belmont Report, which is respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And that's how we ensure that when we conduct research, that it's done in an ethical manner. And so that's why you heard me earlier in the lecture talk about, well, the IRB wanted this and I didn't want that, and I did this and I did that. That's why. They're sort of they're the parent, making sure that things are ethical. And when I served on the IRB, there were two things to me that I was a stickler on, meaning that I would not, if there was any question about voluntary participation, if there was any question about informed consent, I would pose a lot of questions to that researcher. Again, you can't always ensure voluntary participation, even though you want to. You can't always ensure it. But if I found that there was a way to ensure voluntary participation that the researcher did not include in their proposal, I would hammer them on that. And I would not approve it until it was fixed. And I'd say most IRB members would do that too. But those are things that you fixate on. How thorough was this person when they thought about voluntary participation? Do they mention the areas where people potentially could not voluntarily participate? And how do you fight that? How do you deal with that? How do you prevent it? How do you make it better? The thing is, you want people to think of almost as many situations as they can, so that when they're in that situation, they know how to react. And then when people do volunteer to participate, do they know exactly what they're getting into? Is there informed consent? So when they say, yes, I'll participate in the study, they know exactly what they're getting into. And that's where deception comes in. When there is deception, is that deception 100% justified? Those are the two most important things to me. And I'd say any IRB member would probably agree that those are probably the two most important factors. Before we end this, I want to talk about special populations, right? So when we've been talking about research, we've been talking about people who are predominantly free. But there are two groups that IRBs tend to focus on that are not free. And that is your people who are imprisoned or incarcerated and juveniles, right? Juveniles cannot, or they don't have, right? They need their parents or legal guardians to make decisions for them, to consent to things for them, right? So when you want to include a juvenile in a research study, you need to get consent from the parents as well. However, if parents say, yes, Jimmy can participate, but Jimmy says, I don't want to participate, guess what? You don't let Jimmy participate, right? So even though mom and dad give consent, Jimmy is not participating. But if Jimmy says, yes, I'll participate, and mom and dad say no, Jimmy is not participating. So what's the deal with the one special population of juveniles? Both mom and dad or guardian or whatever, aunt, uncle, whatever, have to agree, and the subject has to agree. With inmates, when you deal with them, you have to make 100% sure that they know that them participating in your study is not going to benefit them in any way. It's not going to make them any better. It's not going to reduce any time that they're serving. It's not going to help them get parole faster. It's not going to, punish them anymore. Like, they're not going to go to segregation or whatever they call it now, solitary confinement, if they don't participate, right? So with inmates, you have to make sure that them participating is 100% up to them, and other than the fact that they might get a little benefit from whatever the program is you're studying, they're not going to benefit from a legal standpoint by participating. They're not going to get any privileges. You're not going to give them anything on commissary. No compensation whatsoever. Yeah, so with that being said, that is ethics in criminal justice research. So what should you learn walking away from this? Well, when we conduct research, we need to be respectful to people. We need to make sure that we strike a healthy balance between our ethical standards and what we might accomplish scientifically. And that when we create our research instruments, when we think about how we're designing our study, which is going to be the rest of what we learn in this class, when we're thinking about designing our study, what safety mechanisms are we implementing and thinking of to avoid as much as possible harm to people, to ensure as much as possible voluntary participation, to make sure people know exactly what they're getting into, or to make sure we deceive them as little as possible? And how do we protect people from harm of any kind? So coming up with a research study is not as straightforward as we'd like to think. You have to strike a healthy balance between ethics and science.